This is a brief on my theory of schizophrenia, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the basics of my theory because it's, for beginners, it's a little bit heavy to talk about quantum gravity, quantum field theory, chromodynamics, and Newtonian mechanics and electromagnetic theory applied to an engineering science like 9 matrices and 6 matrices applied to psychology and psychiatry. So here we go with something simple. In simple form, I hold it as the mentally ill person with schizophrenia perceives things in threes and can only respond in twos. Well, most physical objects in reality are taken in threes: forces, angular momentum, rotation like torsion, other things, light waves. I have 3 core components. Acoustic waves. Most everything is three-dimensional, and there are exceptions to this. It's not really worth discussing what exceptions are. In the ordinary mechanical world, outside of quantum mechanics and general relativity, at the human level, the sort of physical level, outside of huge masses, tiny masses, it's essentially Newtonian, and 3 rules govern everything. Even at the subatomic level, quarks compose everything, so it takes effect there too. But let's just work on the main part. So they essentially perceive things in threes, I mean. That means they don't have aberration in perception. I guess what I'd say about that is that if they had aberrations in perception, you see them have very strange responses. They wouldn't just be delusional or contorted, they'd be profoundly off. It'd be worse than a hallucination, because it would mean that they'd coordinate things that were completely unrelated to reality, and were not only imaginative and fantastic, but either profoundly warped in a backwards direction, like they actually had worked when they hallucinate, or it would just be very marked. And I guess you shouldn't really take my word for it, but you should just examine things like that for yourself and come to the conclusion that it's not really a perceptual disorder. A lot of psychiatrists assume that since they have so many hallucinations and delusions, that they are not perceiving things correctly. And if you do a neurological study, like using logic, or at least computer circuits, you'll find that a brain with 1 billion components, or a trillion, I think it is, neurons, functioning at a perceptual, they call it a handicap or disadvantage, but which misfires 1 in 1 billion, will collapse within about 3 minutes of neuron activity. Because there's so much neural activity, and the way the brain works kind of spreads everything out. Everything works at once, and it's a huge mass network of interrelated thoughts. And neurologists will tell you that mental retardation is less than 1 in 1 billion parts decrepitude. Usually in retardation, I believe it's 1 in 1 trillion, meaning that only 1 in 1 trillion chemical synapses don't work correctly in mental retardation. That's partially the reason why I believe it's not perceptual, but it's just in my examinations of mentally ill people, schizophrenics, I basically observed that it's almost never perceptual, even remotely, and in truth, it's never perceptual anyway. It's not even close to it. What I mean by response is basically you receive something correctly if you're schizophrenic, and you respond in twos, meaning that your response is flattened. It's not fully three-dimensional. This is kind of complex because a lot of people would assume that when I say respond, let's say a 3-dimensional light wave hits your face. You perceive it as 3 things, like let's say it has 3 different magnitudes, like polarizations or whatever. You perceive it in 3 different ways. You perceive it correctly, but you only respond in twos. What that means is that your response is like 2-dimensional, meaning it's not 3-dimensional. It's not a full response. What this means is that it's flattened, or in the theory of hydrodynamics, it's called a fluidic response, meaning that it's fluidically non-chaotic, meaning it doesn't emit turbulence, meaning that there's an analytic function, a complex variable function that defines a fluidic response. What this means is that the brain is essentially responding according to water or fluid, blood in the brain. You might actually qualify schizophrenia as a blood disorder, or neuro blood disorder, neurochemical blood disorder. That might actually be where the problem lies. I'm not sure of that, but it's already hypothesized when you look at that amount of evidence. The fluidic level, basically what the fluidic level says that chaotic effects only takes place in 3 dimensions. 2 dimensions, it's always possible to write an analytic function for any potential. It's called the Cauchy-Riemann equations. Take complex variables. Read Eugene Butkov, Mathematical Physics, or Churchill, complex variables, or even Shalm's outline, complex variables. or what's the other one? The blue book by Wiley. It's called Complex Variables, I think, or Complex Analysis. I forgot who the author is. It's the one Penrose likes. But anyways, any of those books will talk to you about what it means to obey the Cauchy-Riemann equation. Particularly Butkov explains to you what the Cauchy-Riemann equations are, and fluidity, continuity, analytic functions. It's usually a senior course at introductory level. It's usually a senior course in colleges for the theoretical math majors. Even applied math uses it too once in a while. So you have to basically read that before you understand what I mean. But let's just go back. It's a two-dimensional response, meaning that, let's say you get hit by a three-dimensional force. Someone punches you. What I mean by this is that schizophrenic will respond in 2 dimensions. It doesn't mean that when he punches back, his fist isn't 3-dimensional. What I mean that what he's aware of doing in motor coordination and like sensation is only 2-dimensional. Not that it's perceptual, but that it's constantly, the response is constantly 2-dimensional, meaning that although his body is 3-dimensional, he only coordinates his brain only coordinates his response in 2 dimensions. What that means is that there's 1 dimension is missing. I don't want to really get into too much of the math of this, because if you've ever studied matrix analysis and like tensors in mechanical engineering, you realize that a 3-dimensional force is actually a 9 matrix in tensile physics. When you use tension or a strain, like 2 objects pulling at each other in a torsional way, like in a 3-dimensional way, that is 9-dimensional. The shear, the strain, and the stress, XYZ cross with each other makes a 9 matrix. In other lectures, I'll explain how to manipulate the 9 matrix, how to flatten it, reduce it, change it, how the neurons interact with the electromagnetic field, how they respond with the strong force, the electroweak force, the gravitational force, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, and all that other stuff in physics. Know how to calculate, predict, use models, and predict things. For this lecture, I'd just like to say that the response is 2-dimensional. And if you think about it, it's probably more like 6-dimensional in matrix analysis, because you got 3 coordinates and 3 by 2, basically. Again, it's fluidic. What this means more concretely is that the response is always limited by a flattening. And if you think about my theory of personality theory and structured psychology and sociology, I like to say that things like personality, turn that on please. Personality, come on, Christina, I said no cussing. Personality, religious orientation, other things are always 3-dimensional. So basically what it means with respect to any sociological or psychological facet, the only one which it doesn't apply to is intelligence, which is usually 12-dimensional. But it applies to the other ones, which are 3-dimensional, meaning that, Christina, please don't cuss. It applies to things that are 3-dimensional, which are most sociological and psychological phenomena in psychology and sociology, like religious orientation, personality. Doesn't apply to criminal orientation, but it applies to a lot of other things. I'm not going to go down the list. I'll explain that later in some other lecture. The theory of 3 forms in sociology and psychology. Let's just take like personality and religious orientation, maybe a few other things, like profession or something. So they respond in 2. So it's greatly flattened. It's only 2-dimensional. It's flattened. It's not a complete response. And a lot of people would wonder where in hell I came up with this idea that it's 3 dimensions and it responded in 2s. And basically the way you think about it, you say that schizophrenics are improper in everything they do. Well, what I first started doing when I began my model of schizophrenia is that I tried to model behavior. Psychiatrists will often talk about tangents. So I tried to model behavior as a curve moving through space in 3 dimensions. A single curve, like a curved line moving through space in 3 dimensions. And I tried to imagine what it means for somebody to be deviant. So I noticed a lot of weird things about interacting with people with schizophrenia and other mental illnesses, particularly schizophrenia, is that they never really respond correctly, and even when they come close, it's never fully correct. And that's what psychiatrists don't really understand in this modern age, is that they say that we're incomplete, or not me, but I'm not schizophrenic, but the people are incomplete, or not really incomplete, but just like partially wrong, or always partly off, or a lot of them like to say we're totally off, but a lot of times we're mostly right. Like, for instance, you ask them hello or hi, how are you? They respond a little, but they don't respond purely correctly. It's always off, maybe a little, sometimes more, and they're paranoid or something. It's definitely off more, but it's basically complex because they weren't able to draw up a model explaining exactly what they mean by when someone being off all the time, and just never really correct. And most psychiatrists would tell you that schizophrenics are almost never correct. And what I've realized is they are never correct. And what it means from a deeper angle is that I began to try to model it. And what I realized, at first I tried to use the complement, meaning of saying that there's a line of correctness through any psychological response or situation which is correct, or at least normal. And then the complement is the entire space, everything except for the line itself and its immediate surroundings, maybe. If you use quantum field theory, you have to use immediate surroundings. But in like quantum mechanics, just a line and the complement. What I realized was the complement was too huge, too chaotic, too huge. Like, you can't really say that a schizophrenic behaves in every way except the way it's correct. For one thing, in quantum field theory, what this leads to is that the complement of what they're thinking is correct. So the brain might be able to reorient itself and be correct occasionally if they use complementary states. This might indicate the brain doesn't oscillate that way, like a difference between contradictory and complementary states that much. Dialectic physics tends to lead to the opposite conclusion. Neutrino oscillations tend to lead to the opposite too. The physics and biology both oscillate back and forth, but that's a little contradictory. I don't want to get into that too much. For our sake of discussion, we'll just say that schizophrenia is, apparently what I realized is the only way to model schizophrenia is that you have to say that if it's always incorrect, how can you define it as always incorrect? Like, if it's always incorrect, how can you draw a model that would indicate that it was always incorrect? And what I realized was that if you assume their schizophrenic's curve through space is only two-dimensional, it's always incorrect because it never has the three components. Also, it's also partially correct, meaning that 2/3 of it is correct, 1/3 of it is wrong. And this isn't always the case. Sometimes 2/3 of it are wrong, or even 3/3, but usually it's a good 1/3. And in fact, it's always at least 1/3. And what I realized was that it's an excellent way to model schizophrenia because it means the affect and a lot of other things, like even thought itself, are never really correct. Again, it's not perceptual, but it's consistent with experimental evidence. And what I realized from this is that with this model, we can explain why they appear normal a lot of times, or at least quasi-normal, why they're so different, and what eventually leads to escalation and catastrophe in their lives, why they sometimes accelerate towards extreme negativity and decrepitude, mental breakdowns and that sort of thing. So it's a consistent model. It's a little bit basic. You may think it's a little bit basic. A lot of people would think that something like brain neurochemistry, but there's a good 9 to 20 neurotransmitters, 9 primary and 20 secondary. It's too complex and three-dimensional and has a good 100 molecules in it or something. Atoms is way too complex to model using something that's simple, but it really does explain a lot. What I began to realize further is maybe a lactic acid disorder, a calcium disorder, a phosphorus disorder, a nitrogen. I don't think it's nitrogen, but phosphorus and phospholipid also, maybe even a phospholipid together. In that sense, it might actually be 6 things, like a lactic acid calcium disorder, or a phospholipid disorder, and a amphetamine, or whatever you call it, a nitrous phosphorus disorder. It's basically chemical reuptake. It's basically the facilitator in the way they're raised, the facilitator in the way their brain develops in embryo, and the genetic predisposition accounts for 1/3. 3 different components: beginning, time in the womb, and afterwards define as schizophrenic. And that's why don't do that, Christina. That's why there's so much difference in the different types. Like, some of them don't hallucinate. It's not funny, Christina. That's why there's so many different types of schizophrenia, like acute, paranoid, chronic, those that don't hallucinate, those that don't need meds. So this basically accounts for that sort of thing. I don't really want to say too much in this lecture. Basically, what I began to realize, since I am an expert in mechanical engineering, civil engineering, and physics, pure and applied physics, and pure and applied math, is that you can take this 3 and 2 model, 3 things perceived correctly, 2-dimensional response, apply tensile mechanics, you get a 9 matrix. Apply genetics codon theory, you get an 8 matrix. I realized that schizophrenia is essentially 8 disorders. The reasoning is a bit abstruse. If you use false reasoning or make faulty assumptions or aren't good at modeling, you'll get a false conclusion. Very easy using codon theory. You may assume it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You have to use special reasoning to realize that it's 8. I'll get into how you prove it in another lecture. The modeling is a bit subtle because a lot of people will say, well, if the codons aren't working and there's 3 of them, then it's 3 things. The codons aren't working 2/3 of the time or 1/3 of the time because it's genetic, then it's one thing. It's one genetic disorder. What Cloninger and I were able to realize, and I did it 3 years before him, please for Christina, in 2013, I did it 3 years before he discovered it in the genetics lab, is that indeed just, we'll go to rickythecat at simplesight.com if you want proof that I discovered it for Cloninger. There's an article dated there from 2015, a year before they discovered it using genetics. That's my proof. I've also got a judge deposition from a psychiatrist saying I believed it was 8 disorders. They tried to take me to court, say I was crazy. It turned out to be true. They had to withdraw their contention. They took me out meds, and now I'm fine. I don't really want to talk about that. It's been a huge scandal having the psych teams after me because I'm not mentally ill. And no, I'm not. Christina, will you stop it? I'm not mentally ill, and these psychiatrists have been harassing me all my life. And it's a great relief to finally realize it. But anyways, with respect to schizophrenia, it is indeed only 8 disorders. You can get it from codon theory, the Rorschach ink block test, attachment disorders, water equilibrium, like the way they like to be levitated in water. You can get it through dialectic theory, which is 8-dimensional. I don't want to get too much into dialectic theory because proving it's 8-dimensional is pretty hard, and at least for beginners. And it's not an impossible or lengthy proof. It's just that the assumptions are very subtle, how to reason that it's 8-dimensional. So you can get it from any of those methods. You can use other methods like seeing it as a genetic disease or a embryonic disease, like the way the baby's orientated in 3 dimensions in the embryo. You can get it through other methods like that. I got 5 or 6, 7 proofs of it now. I'll get into that in a different lecture. For this lecture, I like to say that I begin to think of it in 9 dimensions, which is tensile. It's more useful in discussing psychodynamics, which uses force. What I like to define as force or platonic forms is a second-order logic of reasoning in which the velocity cancels, the constant velocity cancels in the acceleration term. And what you have to employ here is the duplicate, which is basically any sensation perceived twice in a row. It's a little bit complex using that form of logic and reasoning. Eventually I'll get into lectures describing how to reason using force, platonic thought, platonic logic, constant velocity free forms, and how to reason and derive psychiatric and psychological conclusions using the method. It's fairly healthy. It's a very effective theory of describing all their weaknesses and observed phenomena and predicting new ones. It is nowhere inconsistent, predicts everything, makes new predictions, provides new realms of discovery and therapy and medication and resources, provides clinical analysis and nostalgia, and also is intrinsically aesthetic, integrated, unified, non-contradictory, and clearly delineated. And to tell you the truth, it is consistent with physics. It models very much like physics. That way, in God's way, or at least the universe's way, it's very similar to physics. And we evolved in a physical universe. And therefore, when we evolve in a physical universe, you can expect the molecules to behave physical principles. That's why psychology is so physical, why physics applies to it. A lot of people would say, well, if there's over 1 million different biochemicals in the human body, why in hell would behave physics? All these particles behave physically. And so that's basically my model. I do other things with it. I took it quite a ways. I integrated it with most forms of modern physics, like relativity, quantum gravity, chromodynamics, superstrings, general relativity, special relativity. All that's fairly advanced. I'll get into that sometime later. It's not really for the beginner. I don't really expect that many of my viewers to have a doctoral in physics. You need that in order to fully understand my theories. For now, I'll just say that it's just a very integrated theory, and it explains a lot of things. Like, for instance, you can derive why they have mental breakdowns or hallucinate. Hallucinations are basically dreaming aloud, meaning that since their brain is overstimulated by contradictory and interneural networking responses, the weakness of response generates an incomplete form, which conclusions are impossible to draw. So brain neurochemical equilibrium is hyperbolic. It forces more force on those neurons, causing them to overfocus, underachieve, and become overstimulated, or at least over neurologically active, meaning it causes social withdrawal, poverty of thought, and hallucinations. Hallucination is basically because, if you're sleep deprived, you hallucinate. But also, if your brain is overworked and doesn't get rest and keeps working, try to figure things out. It's the same with sleep deprivation. That's why some schizophrenics hallucinate. It's a very simple theory. You can apply it to every single facet of schizophrenia, why they have a thought disorder. Most people would not be able to think very well if they can only respond in two ways. For one thing, it's not logically closed. In other words, you can't move between the proverse and the converse logically, or even derives complex syllogisms if your consequences to a deductive logical syllogism in thought or response always has an incomplete conclusion, like change of thought from one syllogism to the next is incomplete, and the converse is confused and muddled. In fact, according to Venn diagrams, it emits a much larger set of converses, meaning that they have to think about a lot more, and they're just very decrepit for that reason. In time, I'll provide more lectures on how to provide therapy, nosology, medicine, modern medicine, stimulation like electromagnetic waves, TMS, transient electromagnetic shock, and even acoustic and music therapy and psychological therapy, what types of music to play if you have a diagnosis. I'll do that in the future. For now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about why it is the way it is, how I derived my theory. I was doing a lot of other stuff at the time, but that's one of the major theories I came up with at the time. It wasn't the only one. I came up with about 40 of them, but that's one of the more interesting and original ones I came up with. It's not the most original, but it's one of the first, and it first gave me profound insight in predicting it was actually age disorders. In time, I'll upload videos explaining why it is indeed age disorders. The assumptions are a bit technical. For instance, water equilibrium is just up, down, forward, back, and top and bottom. So essentially, it's age disorders, meaning that when you equilibrate, have 4 points of equilibrium, the 4 leveraging arms. It's just 8-dimensional. That's the problem with physicists these days and psychiatrists. They would assume it's 6-dimensional. You have to think in terms of multiplets. The complexity is what you want. Therefore, the probability space, you have to use multiplets. 2 times 2 times 2. Left and right, times top and bottom, times forward and back. 2 times 2 times 2. That's why schizophrenics like it. You use addition, you get an incorrect response because it's not 6 equilibrium points, it's the product space. Not the addition space, the product space, the complexity, the physical movements. Likewise, if you take tension analysis, you may assume it's 9-dimensional or even 12-dimensional because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You can also assume it's 7-dimensional because the point in the middle counts as 1. All that reasoning is false. It takes a lot of insight and ingenuity in physics to really understand why it's false. Each one has a reason. There's 2 reasons, in fact, but that's for another lecture. It's fairly technical. I mean, not just technical. I mean, you probably would need a course in hydrodynamics, but like a 4,000 course in college physics or engineering. But also you need a lot of insight into how to model physics using psychology, how to draw conclusions in psychiatry, how to reason about pathology and behavior. So I'll leave that for another lecture.